Hi everyone, welcome to the October 4th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona, here with my usual co-host Craig Mulkowski, and we are looking back at last week's racing from around the country. An important week in racing as we are just over 4 weeks away from the Breeders' Cup, so there were a lot of Breeders' Cup prep races taking place at the major venues, New York, California, Kentucky. Though, Craig, when I was watching these Breeders' Cup preps from across the country this weekend, it did feel like we had a lot of star power missing from these races. We did see reporting in the last few weeks that there were going to be a couple of high-profile runners, or I should say more than a couple high-profile runners, that were going to be trading up to the Breeders' Cup. So it did feel like a few of these prep races lacked the quality that we typically see.
It's funny you say that. As you were saying a lot of important racing, I was thinking as I perused the speed figures that I assigned for this weekend, it didn't really look all that important at all. But we'll talk a lot more about that as we go race by race. But overall, as a speed figure guy, it was a pretty disappointing weekend for what looked like some contenders going in.
Yes, I probably should have rephrased it. There were some prestigious races run this weekend. Maybe they wouldn't have the implications we expect on the Breeders' Cup. I guess we'll go through that race by race and discuss those implications, though we did have 3 Breeders' Cup Classic prep races take place this past weekend. Flightline was not running in any of them, so I guess with his absence, you can debate the predictive value of any of these races moving ahead to the Classic. But we did have some star power in a few of those races. Let's begin with the Woodward, Craig, which took place at Aqueduct on Saturday. Unfortunately, there was a lot of rain in the New York area throughout this entire weekend. Saturday and Sunday both featured sloppy tracks at Aqueduct, so that's an excuse, I suppose, if your horses didn't run well this past weekend. Life is Good went into this Woodward as the 1-20 favorite. I wouldn't say he necessarily performed like a 1-20 favorite is supposed to, though.
I would agree with that, and the speed figure reflects that. And as you know, I originally rated it a 129. You kind of questioned it a little bit, and I think rightfully so. It made me go back and kind of take a look at what I told you was a difficult card anyway. After I did that, I came up with a 126, which actually matches what the runner-up law professor got because of the pace scenario where we had a pretty slow pace. And I mean, I don't want to overstate it. Life is Good did win a grade 1 race. He did it by 1.25 when challenged. He did pull away, but that didn't look like the same Life is Good that we've seen in earlier starts this year.
Yeah, I think I tweeted after the race that might have been the worst performance of Life is Good's career, and I guess speed figure-wise, maybe that's not the case. He probably ran slower in his first couple of starts, but just in terms of the expectations, obviously he didn't run well in the Dubai World Cup, and I think people were legitimately questioning his ability to go 1.25 miles that day, but he's generally been pretty impressive in the races that he was supposed to win. Some people were comparing this to his Kelso prior to the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile win last year. I don't know, he won that race pretty easily, and he had to work to beat Law Professor in this race. And coming to the quarter pole, it looked dicey for a second because Law Professor with Jose Ortiz aboard was sitting much more chilly in the stirrups than Irad was on Life is Good. He had to start asking him earlier than that horse, did ultimately put that one away on the stretch, but didn't necessarily run through the wire the way that I would have hoped to see. And that, coupled with the visual impression of his Whitney, where I know we gave him a gaudy speed figure for that race, right in line with his top numbers, but I kind of questioned how impressive he was that day. We've seen some horses not run well out of that Whitney, and I just kind of wonder where Life is Good is at this point, and moving ahead to this big matchup with Flightline that so many people have been anticipating for months in the Breeders' Cup Classic, it just kind of feels like he's not really on the same tier as that horse.
Right, and I don't know that it ever looked like he was on the same tier, even when he was running his best races, but that's a different story because of how fast Flightline has run. I can't really compare it to the Kelso either last year. That race was clearly just a paid workout. He finished the race strong. There was absolutely zero competition in that race last year. This year, it was a pretty decent horse he was facing. That was the runner-up. He's not a horse who's going to threaten in the Breeders' Cup Classic, I don't think personally, but he's okay, and Life is Good was able to shake him off, but he's got a long way to go to be, in my eyes, a horse that could really threaten Flightline, because I just didn't see it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to do too much handicapping 4.5 weeks before the race, but at this point in time, just given the way the field is supposed to come up, I'd personally be shocked if Life is Good even hits the board in the Classic, but we'll see how that all plays out. I guess kind of have to wait to handicap those races until you see how the field is drawn, but it seems like it's coming up a very strong Breeders' Cup Classic this year. Let's move on to a couple of the other preps we saw this weekend for the Breeders' Cup Classic. One was a Grade 2 event at Churchill Downs, but actually featured a more competitive field in the Woodward. That was the Lucas Classic. And Hot Rod Charlie, Craig, a horse that some people have gotten a little bit tired of because it feels like he fails to get the job done more than he actually visits the winner's circle in these top races. But he's a good horse who just always shows up with a competitive effort, and he was able to show his grit here as he battled back inside of the 3-year-old Rich Strike, who has been validating his upset victory in the Kentucky Derby with his last two performances both here and in the Travers. There was some controversy in the final 16th of a mile of this race, though.
There was, and I actually think it had an effect on the speed figure. This came back a pretty darn slow race for the class. I mean, it's a Grade 2. On paper, it looked like it could have been a borderline Grade 1. But it didn't turn out very fast at all. It went 149.77. We had an allowance race just 2 races earlier on the card, one by Open Road. I think it was a non-winners of 1 allowance, if I'm not mistaken, that went 149.81, so just 4/100 slower. And I really couldn't get around find any way to come up with a reason to break those races out separately. It just came back kind of a slow race. I think it's a combination of some horses just didn't show up. Art Collector didn't run well after making the lead early. Happy Saver had some issues as well with the ride that we're going to get into, I think. But the top 2 looked okay, but they only got Hot Rod Charlie gets a 118 speed figure, Rich Strike a 116. And I do think those shenanigans by the rider Sonny Leone on Rich Strike probably had something to do with that. He started early. He was definitely race riding, coming around the turn into the stretch, kind of keep Happy Saver pinned in, which he successfully did, I guess. But then I didn't get what he was doing at all against Hot Rod Charlie. It looked like if he had just put his head down, flat on the chest and gave a good ham ride, he was going to win the race. But that's not what he did, and I'll let you talk more about that.
Yeah, it was an odd thing to see. I mean, when you watch the pan shot, you knew that something had happened because you don't often watch a horse blow by another one and then suddenly get passed again at the wire. I mean, I guess I think about that Parks Dirt Mile from last year where Silver State made what seemed like that winning move and then Mind Control came back on him to win. This was a different situation, though, because it did feel like they had come together at the end and you could just see something happen, but you weren't sure exactly what. I mean, Hot Rod Charlie is a game horse when he has his mind on running and he's going to fight you for it. Often he comes out on the losing side of those photos, unlike last Saturday, but he typically is involved at the end of his races, so wasn't that surprising to see him kind of re-engage when Rich Strike passed him. But if you did go back and watch the head-on view of the stretch drive, I also posted it on my Twitter account if you haven't seen it. I think it's worthwhile to view because to my eye, it's very clear what happened. Rich Strike got steered over to the left to meet Hot Rod Charlie, and then there was clearly some leaning, some elbowing going on with Tyler Gaffalione on Hot Rod Charlie as Sonny Leone kind of reached over and got in his space. He reached over so much that it seemed to me like he caused himself to lose his balance a little bit, and it created a little bit of a dangerous situation for both riders. But I did see the post-race quotes afterwards where they quickly came up with the excuse that the saddle slipped. Look, Craig, we've all watched a lot of races. We've seen incidences of saddle slipping. I've never seen one, first of all, at this point in the race when it's been fine for the entire race, and then at the wire, your saddle slips when it seems like you have perfect balance before that. Usually it happens when you're restraining a horse and, you're leaning forward in the stirrups and doing something, applying pressure on the saddle that causes it to slip out of position. I would say, yeah, he was applying pressure on the saddle, but just not in the way that people think.
Yeah, I agree. That certainly didn't look like any saddle slip that I've seen before. It just looked like he was riding erratically and not in the way you're supposed to ride a horse. And apparently the stewards at Churchill Downs agreed because they handed him a 15-day suspension, and it was deserved.
Yes, I think we can agree on that. In racing, people often see what they want to see. You have your biases going in, and I know that some people are never going to believe that he did anything intentionally. If you're a big fan of Rich Strike, I think you don't want to believe that, but I don't know. I've seen a lot of these, and to me, that looked pretty clear. We don't have to dwell on it any further. With regard to the time, Craig, I think it is a difficult situation because a lot of these horses had run so much faster in their prior starts, especially those runners coming out of the Whitney, Hot Rod Charlie, and Happy Saver. And, you do kind of wonder, is it possible they could have regressed so much? I did see that the Beyer speed figure team, they must have broken this race out because they actually rated this race faster than the Woodward by about 4 points. And it's a difficult situation. We're going to talk about that allowance race earlier on the card that you could compare it to, also at 9 furlongs, but they were only 2 races apart, so I think it's a little difficult to separate those two.
I agree. And this was one of the rare cases I did look up the Buyers. They actually gave this one, I think it was a 101, and they gave the other one a 97 or something like that, 93. I believe I saw an 8-point difference, whatever the figures were. The reason I couldn't do that is because there was another race run after it. And even though it was a sprint race, that sprint race fit perfectly in line with all the other sprint races. I didn't see the track getting slower. As a matter of fact, if I thought it got slower, then the two in the last race already ran way faster than they had previously. If I split it out even more, it just wouldn't make any sense. So I'm pretty comfortable with the slow figure. I do think the shenanigans had something to do with it. Maybe that Whitney's rated a little bit high. That could have something to do with it. But I just don't think it was a very strong race.
At the end of the day, I don't think anybody's viewing these horses from the Lucas Classic as being the top contenders moving ahead to the Breeders' Cup Classic. Rich Strike, not among the best 3-year-olds out there, and Hot Rod Charlie, maybe he's in the top 5 older horses, but I don't think people consider him to be a real threat to beat Flightline in that race. Speaking of Flightline, I think we were looking to get a little bit of a read on his last performance in the Pacific Classic when a few of the rivals that he soundly defeated ran back in the Grade 1 Awesome Again at Santa Anita on Saturday. This race also a prep for the Breeders' Cup Classic, which Flightline skipped. Though, Craig, I'm not sure that we got the answers we were looking for, as some of those Pacific Classic runners, it just seemed like they did not show up in this race. I mean, the only one that ran a competitive race really was Country Grammar, and you could say he's better going 1.25 miles than he is going 1.125 miles, but he wasn't supposed to lose to his stablemate Defunded.
Yeah, I don't think so. He is a weird horse, though. You wouldn't think a furlong would make that much difference. But just watching the race, it's bizarre. He looked like he was kind of finished on the turn. He was actually losing ground to Defunded. He really wasn't going anywhere. And then that last furlong, all of a sudden he kicked in. So I guess if I was going to give one horse a little bit of an excuse, maybe it would be him. His stablemate Defunded was all out there by himself. He was within himself. The fractions were decent. They weren't in red or anything like that, but it was a solid enough effort. But just another disappointing race, I would say. The winner Defunded got a 123 speed figure, which was in line with pretty much all his best races, right there in the mid 120s. And really, nobody else did a lot of running. I mean, Slow Down Andy, I thought he ran okay for a 3-year-old. Ran a career best speed figure, moving back to dirt. He was in the unenviable position of chaser, one which I don't like very much, but I thought he ran okay. But the others, just not much. Royal Ship was a complete no-show, so I don't know what happened to him.
Yeah, Country Grammar's an odd horse. Like you said, he often looks like he's not traveling well in his races. When you really get into him, sometimes he'll eventually respond, kind of like he did in the Dubai World Cup when it looked like he was spinning his wheels, and then he kicked in very late. Sometimes he does need the 10 furlongs to hit that final gear. It just looked like he never quite got there in here. Still, though, the winner of this race, Defunded, I mean, I know that he had that decent second place finish in the Grade 1 Gold Cup earlier in the year, but we had talked about at the time, Craig, how that seemed like such a weak race for this division, and his 2 prior performances coming in here, they were not nearly up to this level. I guess he appreciated being sent out to the front end. The pace was honest. It's not like there was some speed bias, though, at Santa Anita on Saturday. Actually, we're going to talk about some of the other dirt races. They were won by closers, so I didn't see the track helping him at all. Just kind of a weird situation where it seemed like a lot of horses didn't show up, and I have to ask the question, Craig, do the performances of Country Grammar, Express Train, and Royal Ship at all make you question the number that we gave Flightline in that Pacific Classic, that maybe it's a little on the high side? I mean, obviously, it was going to be a stratospheric speed figure, but I mean, we did see all three of these horses come back and regress.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's a little too early to go that far. Maybe those horses did come back reasonably quick after that last race. Maybe it took something out of them. I don't think any of them ran their best race on this day. So for me, it's a tough call. It's a little bit too early to say. I mean, Express Train is the one I would pin it on the most. He regressed about 6 points. I had said when I did the figure, I could have went as low as a 146. So maybe that's a more reasonable effort. I don't know. It would take some more time to see some more run backs for me. I don't like to get too carried away by just a couple run backs, especially when they're all from one race.
No, I agree with that. And I don't think anybody's saying that Flightline is vulnerable in the Breeders' Cup Classic because of a 6 point difference. And that's not the case when you win by 19 lengths and earn a speed figure that's, 20 plus points higher than everybody else in the field. As for Slowdown Andy, who you mentioned, Craig, I think this just shows that some of the 3-year-olds I think are missing opportunities by not running in these races for older horses at the end of the year. It just seems like these days every 3-year-old runs in the Travers or the Pennsylvania Derby and completely ignores, the Woodward, often the Awesome Again, or the Lucas Classic, or these other prep races for the Breeders' Cup. And I'm not sure that some of these races for the older runners aren't actually softer than races like the Travers and the Pennsylvania Derby.
Especially this year, we had some pretty darn good 3-year-olds we saw, particularly Epicenter last time out. Taba looked really good. So, I mean, if either one of those horses were in this race, I would imagine they would have went favored. So, Slow Down Andy showed that the gap is simply not as big this time of year as it is earlier in the year when we're talking about these horses as Triple Crown horses, and shortly thereafter as they go into races like the Haskell and the Travers. It's time for them to run against older horses. And you're right. I don't get why there's so few that do it anymore. Used to be a common thing.
It did used to be a common thing. That was before the Pennsylvania Derby kind of moved back on the calendar, and connections tried to find the path of least resistance for all of their horses. But I feel like some of them might have miscalculated this year. Well, Craig, since we're talking about Santa Anita, let's kind of run through the other stakes races that they ran there last weekend. I don't feel like we have to spend that much time on most of these races, Craig, because as we've been talking about for much of the year, a lot of the best horses in each of these divisions are not stabled in Southern California at the moment. So a lot of these races just lacked a little bit of quality. Let's begin with some of the turf races from Saturday, the Grade 2 City of Hope Mile. This one actually earned a respectable speed figure as Beyond Brilliant wired the field, but once again, I don't think anybody's mistaking these horses as real contenders in the Breeders' Cup Mile.
No, not at all. We've seen him when he gets a clear lead, he's pretty good, which he did here. He runs these kind of low 120 speed figures, which he did. He was able to hold off Kafkin Peak, but I just don't see it. And to be fair, it's not like the mile division has been strong anywhere in the U.S. this year. But it's just hard for me to imagine that there aren't going to be some Euros coming over and just look a lot better on paper than this field.
Yeah, it seems like most are already conceding that race to Modern Games, who was so impressive winning that Woodbine Mile, and I'm sure there are going to be other Europeans coming over that are going to make that race a lot tougher than some of these, U.S. preps have been. I did not see a whole lot that would make me want to take Beyond Brilliant moving forward from this race. He got the right trip. I thought Kafkin Peak ran well for second, closing into, that lonely lead, but it just kind of felt like a race that did get a respectable speed figure, but I kind of doubt the quality moving forward. And the same thing for the Grade 2 John Henry Turf Championship a little bit earlier in that Saturday card. Similar situation where Master of Foxhounds just kind of got away and stole it on the front end, but he was getting leg weary late, and I thought it was the decisive move to kind of open up 3 lengths on the quarter pole that allowed him to hold on.
Right, and he did so only getting a 119 speed figure, set a moderate pace. Nobody was, I mean, Dicey Mochara was closing in at the end, I guess, but it wasn't, it's just another weak race. Hard for me to get excited about it. If I had to pick one that ran the best, I might go with Gold Phoenix, the third place finisher, who actually came from a little further back than everyone else. But again, just not a really strong race.
Back over to back to sprinting. We saw the grade 2 Eddie D run a little bit later in the card. This one going 6.5 furlongs down the hill at Santa Anita. And an upset here, Craig, as What Makes Sammy Run got the job done at what was probably a generous 18-1. I know that neither of us were that enthralled with this horse's chances, and we talked about him on the forecast last week, but I don't think either of us completely wrote him off. He had run against some very good horses earlier in the year, and I think it was just a little bit of class relief here and also getting the right pace set up, because this race really did fall apart.
Yeah, looking at the top four, I think he was the closest of the top four finishers after the opening quarter mile. All of the speed backed out of it. We do have the opening quarter in red. It was a 21:38, but remember, down the hill, you can't really take the fractions at face value going down that hill. But it was quick. It got a quick pace figure, and just another one. He only got a 116 speed figure for the win. I think that's a lifetime best for him. But this was a race that we talked about, as you mentioned, and it looked like any horse could win this race. So to me, it's not all that surprising that the second longest shot in the field did so.
We also saw an upset in another sprint on Saturday at Santa Anita on the dirt course. That was the Grade 2 Santa Anita Sprint Championship. This one, the prep for the Breeders' Cup Sprint. And a similar situation with regard to the pace, Craig, as they went pretty quickly up front, and that did set things up for it to fall apart a little bit. Howbeit, the winner probably just in the right place at the right time to get his nose on the wire first. CZ Rocket was charging from last place at the very end, but looking at these two horses' performances coming into the race, it just kind of makes you question, where are all the good sprinters in California? Because it felt like they didn't show up here.
No, Mark Glad had himself a pretty good 40 minutes or so, winning both of these races that we're talking about. This was one I would have had trouble to come up with. We talked about how weak the race was, and actually, as I perused the chart, he was just as fast as everybody else. I just think we were expecting maybe some horses to improve a bit this time out. None of them really did. The upside for me was it was cool to see CZ Rocket run a decent race, but speed figures like 115, this was not a grade 2 race.
No, and I mean, I guess if there's a horse you want to cut some slack, it could be Forbidden Kingdom, since he was coming off the layoff. He was drawn inside. He had to rush up to contest that fast pace. Actually, if you're looking at the TimeformUS speed figures, he got the co-highest number in the race at 118, even though he finished fifth. That just speaks to how fast the early pace was. But, I mean, if you were expecting Forbidden Kingdom to take the kind of step forward that you might have hoped for after the way that he had performed early in the season, you just didn't get that improvement here. So it was a little disappointing, and it's just not a race that I would really want to take anybody out of moving forward.
No, and I agree. This was a very fast pace. We have all the fractions in red, the top two early, finished next to last and last. So it was definitely a pace duel. I'm just not sure how good a race this was that I would be anxious to bet either one of those two back going forward.
On Sunday at Santa Anita, they ran their prep for the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Sprint, and we did see the last winner of the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Sprint in action here, as Cece went off as the heavy favorite to win this Grade 3 Chillingworth for the second year in a row. I'm not sure if history can repeat itself, Craig, but I will say it's not like she ran that fast a speed figure when she won this race last year, and she improved a lot in the Breeders' Cup, so maybe they were just hoping to get a confidence builder, and I guess they accomplished that.
Yeah, this seemed the Filly and Mare Sprint seems pretty open. I mean, I don't even know who the favorite would be. Maybe Goodnight Olive, who ran that big speed figure at Saratoga, but she's kind of a one-hit wonder at this point. So it's a tough one for me. I don't have the official speed figures for these Sunday races we're going to talk about. I took my best guess, and I actually hope I'm wrong because they all look pretty darn slow to me. It looks like CC's going to get around a 107 speed figure, which is just not much. But she did run a 109 last year. It should be noted, though, when she won the Filly and Mare Sprint, she did so with only a 117 TimeformUS speed figure. Gamine didn't really show up as the heavy favorite, and it was probably the weakest edition of the race that I can remember. So I think she's got her work cut out for her this year.
It does seem that way, but she's shown up when people underestimated her in the past. So I never want to count out Cece. She is a very likable horse, but she was not beating the strongest field on Sunday at Santa Anita. Kind of similar situation with the Grade 2 Zenyatta, Craig. This one, the prep for the Breeders' Cup Distaff. I think it would be an even bigger surprise if any of the horses coming out of this race were factors there, because it just looked like a pretty weak field going in. The 2 3-year-olds did finish first and second here, and I suppose you could say that the winner, Midnight Memories, does have some upside. She's 4 for 5 in her career as a lightly raced horse for Bob Baffert, but I think this race came up pretty slow as well.
Yeah, it's probably going to right around the 108 range, which is actually a little bit of a regression for her. Not the strongest race. She got kind of an easy lead early. The fractions were kind of slow, so hard for me to get excited about.
Well, Bob Baffert did pick up another stakes win on Sunday at Santa Anita with the 2-year-old Speedboat Beach, who somewhat surprisingly switched over to the turf for her second start, considering the fact that he earned a 120 TimeformUS speed figure in his career debut on the dirt. I guess the thinking is he's not a Breeders' Cup juvenile horse, and if you want to run in the Breeders' Cup, the turf sprint would be the only race that makes sense, so they just tried to get a read on whether he can handle the turf here, and I don't know, Craig. I guess he ran okay on it, but he certainly didn't run as well as he did in his debut.
Yeah, that was a bit of a puzzling entry, which you say makes sense because I couldn't figure it out. I thought maybe it was just the embarrassment of riches that Bob Baffert has so many fast 2-year-olds. He was looking for something a little different, looking for a spot to keep them away from each other. But yeah, maybe they're going to try the turf. That said, he didn't run anywhere near the same speed figure he did as when he tried dirt for the first time. My guess is he's going to get about a 101. It looked like a pretty tough speed figure, so I'm going to leave that one to me or to my assistant. So before I put out an official figure, I'll wait till I get it from him before I put it on Twitter. But he looked good enough, I guess, but it's hard to see that really being his best surface.
Yeah, I think we might end up with 2 of these types of runners in the Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint this year. We're going to talk about another runner later in the podcast that might also wind up in that race without having much turf experience. Speedboat Beach, though, I mean, he's definitely a horse with a lot of talent. Just maybe turf won't ultimately be his best surface. I guess we'll find out more about him in some subsequent starts. Let's stick with the 2-year-olds, but move over to New York to wrap up the racing from Aqueduct last week, or Belmont at the Big A. They did run their traditional preps for the Breeders' Cup Juvenile and Juvenile fillies, those Grade 1 Champagne and Frizette. Saturday was the Champagne, Craig, where, again, we were dealing with a sloppy sealed track at Aqueduct, and it seemed like the winner, Blazing Sevens, did not mind the wet going on this occasion after seeming to struggle with a little bit in the hopeful in his prior start, but I guess the result of this race did flatter Forte a little bit.
I would say I wound up giving a speed figure of 110 in here. It's one of those I went back when I did the Life is Good race. I redid the whole card, and it actually went up a couple of points to that 110. But it sure looked like a pretty good effort to me. I liked the way he did it. He looked professional. The one question would be the wet track. How much did that help or hurt? You know, I never fully trust these off-track races when horses move to a fast track, if indeed that's what we get at Keeneland. You never know this time of year, but we'll hope so. But I thought it was a pretty good effort. Obviously, the disappointment here, I guess, would have to be Gulfport. It's not like he ran terrible, but I don't know if he wants to go that far. I'm starting to wonder if he wasn't just a horse who was a little more developed than his peers early on, and everybody else has caught up. And as you know, I never really had him all that fast to start with, and he just seems to be okay to me.
Yeah, I think that's the problem with Gulfport. People had overrated him off his first couple of starts, and I actually think he's run just as well as you might have expected in his last 3 races at Saratoga and at Aqueduct now. The speed figures have actually gone up for Gulfport. He's just run into some tougher horses, and I think it's as simple as that, and he's been overbet in all these races because he kind of had a reputation going into those tougher tests. The other horse we should mention from this race is Verifying, who was second. He's a horse that a lot of people had liked coming out of his debut on track Driver's Day at Saratoga. He, of course, is the younger half-brother to Midnight Bisou, and he ran fine on the stretch out in distance, kind of got there, but just didn't have the stamina to see out the last part of the race, as Blazing Sevens really did run away from the field at the very end here. So Blazing Sevens, clearly a horse that appreciated the added ground. I think we're still waiting for that confirmation from a few others of the runners that participated in this Champagne. Let's move on to Sunday's feature, that Grade 1 Frizette. This one was won by the favorite, Chocolate Gelato, though I'm not sure that backers of the favorite were necessarily expecting her to do it this way, as she came from off the pace, something that she had not done in her maiden victory when she had gone gate to wire to win at Saratoga. But Craig, nice to see this professionalism from a 2-year-old filly to sit that trip in behind horses in the mud and still pick them up in the stretch.
Yeah, her speed figure regressed a little bit, and of course, as speed figure makers, nobody cares about us. They ran these two races on separate days, the Champagne and the Frizette. Missed the old days when they did not do that, but that's the hand we're dealt. And but I'm not actually worried about the regression too much. He went from a 106 at 6 furlongs back to 100. But I'd much rather see the way she ran this race. She was kind of wide, so I'm not going to hold the speed figure against her too much. I thought she ran pretty darn good.
Yeah, I liked that turn of foot that she displayed at the quarter pole when she made that move from fifth up to take the lead. I did get the sense through the final furlong of this race, like, maybe she's a horse that isn't a true router, because she got there, got to the front like she was maybe going to pull away and win this race by 3 lengths, and she just kind of stalled at the end, never really got that separation on the runner-up You're My Girl, who did battle on gamely after setting the pace. But I still wonder if this daughter of Practical Joke, Chocolate Gelato, if she really wants to go the 2 turns that she's probably going to try her next start. So I have some questions about her, but she was the best horse on the day in this Frizette. Let's stick with the 2-year-olds at Aqueduct, but move over to the turf course, as we saw a couple preps for those Breeders' Cup Juvenile turf races. On Saturday, they ran the Grade 2 Miss Grillo, and kind of a surprising early leader and winner of this race, Craig, is Pleasant Passage, who looked like one of the slowest horses coming in, both on speed figures and especially on pace figures, somehow found herself on the early lead and wired the field.
Hats off to Arad Ortiz. He won this race, in my opinion, by being aggressive, taking the lead in a race where it didn't look like anybody really wanted it. And on that course, which even though it was listed as yielding, I would say it was more like a good course. Going by our track condition ratings, it really wasn't as bad as it seemed. She ran 100 speed figure, so a big jump up from her 86. The rest of the field kind of ran what they had run the last time out. So hats off to Irad. I sometimes get critical of him. I don't always like how aggressive he is, but there can be no doubt that he is one of the best riders, if not the best rider in the game. And it's for reasons like this. He took the bull by the horns. He's not always super aggressive, but he does it at times, and it was definitely the right move.
Yeah, I do think it helped that some other riders clearly had other ideas in their head. You know me, I love me some Joel Rosario, but I have no idea what he was doing with I'm Just Kidding in this race, who looked like the clear speed, and he just had intentions to drag her to the back of the pack at the start of this race. Maybe he was riding to instructions, but that was very surprising. Flavian Pratt, I think, did what he could to get free look into position stalking the pace as a horse who had come from far back in her 2 prior starts, but could just never really reel in Pleasant Passage, who always was able to find more. And I don't want to totally discount the effort of the winner, Craig, because she is a horse that clearly had upside coming out of her debut victory for Shug McGahee, a trainer that does get them to improve with time. I had seen some of the workout reports coming into this race that were suggesting that she might have taken a big step forward since that debut. So it's possible that she's a horse that just is improving, but she certainly got a perfect trip in achieving this victory.
Yeah, I'm not knocking her at all. She had that 14-point jump. I think it was legitimate. I just think Irad was a big part of that. And she's already shown she can come from off the pace. She can run in traffic. She can run on the lead. So that does count for something. She's had those different experiences and can adapt.
Well, we actually saw Irad sweep both of these races for the 2-year-olds, as he also took down the Frizette for the fillies that we just covered with Chocolate Gelato. But he had another winner on that Sunday card of the Grade 2 Pilgrim with Major Dude, who got sent off at 10-1 as he was making his turf debut here. All the money went to that impressive Chad Brown debut runner, I'm Very Busy. And Craig, these two hooked up at the top of the stretch. It looked like I'm Very Busy had dead aim on Major Dude, and that one just turned him away.
He did. It was a strong effort from Major Dude. He jumped up to 100 speed figure, similar to the Phillies. Just like the dirt races, these were run on different days. But in this case, it was probably a good thing given all the rain. The course was definitely softer on Sunday than it was on Saturday. But I liked what I saw from Major Dude. For some reason, I thought I had memory of you saying you wanted to see this horse on turf. Maybe I'm wrong about that. You can fill me in. I should make notes when you make these statements, but he certainly looked like he handled it better than he did the dirt. He looked good to me.
I probably did say that when we were handicapping the Sanford going all the way back to the beginning of the summer because he had plenty of turf pedigree, and I guess I didn't anticipate him going off at 10-1 in this race. I picked him second to I'm Very Busy, who took all that money to be 3-5 in here. But yeah, I was not that shocked to see him improve on the turf because he's got the dam side pedigree, and these sons and daughters of Bolt Doro have really taken to the turf pretty well. We saw him have a big price first-time turf winner at Saratoga in the With Anticipation. Now, again, a similar situation here with a first-time turfer winning the Pilgrim. So, very interesting. Bolt Doro's had success across the board, but especially with some of these runners trying the turf in his first crop. And I don't want to take anything away from I'm Very Busy. I think you can give horses a pass because of the turf condition a little bit. He didn't quite have that same turn of foot that we saw from him in his maiden victory at Saratoga. I would imagine both of these horses will proceed on to the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Turf. And let's wrap up the stakes action from last week at Aqueduct with another race they ran on Saturday's card, the Grade 3 Belmont Turf Sprint. This one was won in dominating fashion by the New York-bred Dancing Buck in a race that really did change after scratches, Craig. It had looked like there might be some speed in there when it was first drawn. We had two of the speeds scratch. Another horse who was expected to be up front, Yes and Yes, failed to break sharply in this race, and it had just allowed Dancing Buck to shake loose early, and they could never get close to him.
The break of Yes and Yes, in addition to the scratches, of course, but especially the break of Yes and Yes, the race was over. Dancing Buck went right to the front under Manny Franco. He got a very slow opening quarter, even for this yielding course. It wound up only a 105 pace figure. And at that point, the race was essentially over. Chewing Gum was chasing him, a horse who's never really up that close. So he just ran away from the field. It seemed like he increased his margin from start to finish all the way to the wire. Not sure what to make of this race. He got a good speed figure, a 118. Nobody else did. Those are the kind of races I'm a little bit leery of, especially in turf sprints. I'm just not sure what to make of this one.
Yeah, this was one of those that was yet another frustrating race for me to watch at Aqueduct last week because I felt like I had made a good pick with Yes and Yes, and it was just all over at the start, and he actually ran pretty well to almost be second in this race, but nobody was in the same league as Dancing Buck. He is not nominated to the Breeders' Cup, so the connections are still mulling over whether they're going to supplement him, I believe, for $100,000 to run in the turf sprint. I think they're kind of 50-50 on that front. So we'll see what they decide to do, but this is the kind of race where I'm not sure this form is necessarily going to translate if the course comes up firm on Breeders' Cup Day.
Yeah, I was going to say, if I owned him, I wouldn't be spending $100 to run him in that race. Just especially that race, it's just such a crapshoot. The slightest bobble or half a step slow out of the gate, and you're probably done. So, yeah, it'll be interesting to see who shows up, but he wouldn't be one of my top.
Well, we did talk a little bit about Churchill Downs at the start of the show. Let's briefly circle back there to talk about a couple other races from their Saturday card. The other graded stakes that they ran on Saturday at Churchill was the Grade 3 ACAC going a mile. And this one featured the first stakes victory for Senior Buscador since he won that springboard mile as a 2-year-old, Craig. Spent a lot of time on the sidelines after that, but seems like this horse is now reaching some new heights now that he's a 4-year-old.
Yeah, some training effort to get this horse back where he was. As I said, he was a horse I really liked what I saw as a 2 year old. He came back this year at Lone Star with a win in an allowance race, kind of slow, but he steadily progressed each time out. He's gotten better speed figures each time, all the way up to running a 121 in this spot, which is a career best for him. So just a really nice job by Tim Fincher to get him back in form. I assume he'll be pointed to the Breeders' Cup Mile or Dirt Mile, and for me, I have no idea who's showing up for, for that race at this point. But it seems like he would fit in there. It just depends what the competition looks like.
Yeah, it does kind of feel like that dirt mile is going to be the undercard stakes that it's supposed to be this year, with all of the top contenders actually going to the Breeders' Cup Classic instead, or so they say at this point in time. I mean, that could be a pretty competitive race, which is what you like to see. I mean, regardless of whether you think the dirt mile should be a race or not, it does feel like it could come up a competitive handicapping affair this year. And Senior Buscador, based on this effort, Craig, I think he puts himself in the mix. Also, a game effort from the runner-up Injunction, a horse who on occasion has run some big speed figures. He outran his odds to be second. Obviously, the big no-show in here was Speaker's Corner, who has just not been the same horse ever since facing Flightline and Life is Good earlier in the year. And I don't know if it's a thing where horses get their hearts broken and they're not the same after that, but it feels like that might be the case with Speaker's Corner.
It does. I'm not one that subscribes to that theory very often, but I don't really think he had any excuses here. I saw some people questioning the ride, and I just don't see it when he really had no running. Maybe you could have blamed the surface for the run at Del Mar as just something totally new to him, but it just seems like chasing Flightline and then chasing Life is Good took something out of him. It's not just that he was in a race with them. He actually fought with those two horses. He took the lead over Flightline early, battled with him briefly before trying to chase him home, and then he actually was actually dueling with Life is Good in a 7 furlong race, and maybe it just did sap something out of him.
Now, with regard to the Lucas Classic, we had mentioned earlier in the show there was another 9 furlong race run just 2 races earlier on that Saturday card that you could compare the Lucas Classic to. This one was an allowance race, N1X for the 3-year-olds, and got a very similar final time to the Lucas Classic. I get that there are some difficulties comparing these two races, just given the expectations going in were very different, but I do think that the two horses who battled to the wire here, Open Road and Strong Quality, they are both some 3-year-olds with some quality.
Right, and they're both kind of lightly raced, so I don't think it's a huge stretch to say that these horses ran a pretty fast race. When I looked through the chart and looked at the horses in the other positions, and all the speed figures seem to fit. So that's another reason I just didn't want to tinker with the Lucas and just make an arbitrary decision that they couldn't have run that slow, because all the evidence pointed to me that this race was legit. The track stayed consistent throughout the card, and I do think these are a couple of pretty decent 3 year olds. I don't want to slight Strong Quality either, who ran a good race, has been moving in the right direction. He had a brief layoff between March and September, but he's come back better than ever.
Yeah, Open Road, a first-time route here for Brad Cox, definitely improved with the added distance, and yeah, Strong Quality, a horse from Mark Casse that I've developed a liking for. He's just a big, beautiful horse, and he's pretty game. He really fights you for it, and he was trying to get back on terms with Open Road for the entire stretch drive, just couldn't quite do it, but these two did run nice races to complete the exacta here, both earning those 115 TimeformUS speed figures. Craig, let's finish things up on this podcast by taking our monthly trip out to Prairie Meadows to discuss the 2-year-old Tyler's Tribe, who I know has become one of your favorite juveniles running right now. And he continued his win streak, now extending it to 5 in a row here as he took down the Prairie Meadows Cradle. And this could be his final prep for a Breeders' Cup assignment.
Yeah, I'm not sure, unfortunately, that there's really a race for him. I know there's an undercard race for juveniles going 6 furlongs. I'd almost rather see him going in that one. He does not look like a horse that wants to run long to me. Who knows about turf? Maybe they'll give him a try on the turf. He's certainly fast. No doubt about that. His speed figure did regress a little bit from that 120 last time down to a 105 this time. I'm not sure that even matters. He was never really asked to run. What I found interesting in this spot was we were told before the race that he was going to keep running for another 2 furlongs and work out to the run a mile. And I don't know what happened, but that sure wasn't it. He didn't do anything of the sort. I think his next 2 furlongs, they actually announced the time, were in 30 seconds. But it's basically meaningless because you can watch it. In no way whatsoever was he ridden out at all.
Yeah, I guess there was some sort of miscommunication between the trainer and jockey because it didn't seem like she was really interested in motivating this horse after the wire, which I guess would have been the idea to work this horse out a mile. Never really asked this horse for anything. So, like you said, I'm not going to put too much stock in that 105 speed figure, the regression, because he won this race so easily. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, they're now saying after this race that since that gallop out didn't really work as planned, they're going to abandon the idea of running in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile, probably looking more at the Juvenile Turf Sprint, which I guess he could get in based on accomplishments and earnings and speed figures he's run, but I don't know. He is a son of Sharp Azteca, whose progeny have had some success on the turf, so maybe, but that's a tough race often with plenty of European contenders, so I don't know. Like you said, there might not be a perfect Breeders' Cup race for him, but he is a pretty cool horse.
Yeah, he is. I'll certainly keep rooting for him. I'll root for him wherever he shows up. I'd probably even bet him if he ran on the undercard race. But in the others, who knows? I guess we'll just have to see who shows up. But it really is a cool story for horse racing. The winner's circle after the race, I couldn't even count how many people were in there. I know we mentioned it once before, but there's a good story. Mary Rampolini kind of follows it. So look her up on DRF if you get a chance and aren't familiar with the story.
Well, that's all the racing to recap from this past week, but since it is Breeders' Cup prep season, we've got a lot to look forward to on the calendar this upcoming week. The Keeneland meet opens, and with the Breeders' Cup being run at Keeneland this year, I'm sure some of those prep races that they traditionally run are going to be loaded. I would hope so, since a few of the prep races that we saw this past week did come up a little bit thin, so I would imagine that a lot of trainers are waiting to run at Keeneland to get that experience over the racetrack. We'll see how that all works out this week, and hopefully the weather cooperates. But I'm sure that Craig and I will find something to handicap at Keeneland on the TimeformUS Forecast later in the week. These cards usually come up pretty strong at this time of the year. Everybody, remember you can always listen to these podcasts on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Again, thanks for tuning in this week, and make sure to catch that TimeformUS Forecast coming up this Friday.